There's no desire to take money away. In fact, we want to see schools open. If schools aren't going to reopen and not fulfill that promise, they shouldn't get the funds.
Donald Trump's Education Secretary Betsy DeVos was on CNN and on Fox News this weekend and displayed a level of incompetence often unseen. But Betsy DeVos has it in spades. Now, what is striking about these two clips is the difference in tone and the response. So apart from the obvious incompetence that is displayed in both clips, the difference in response that Betsy DeVos has on CNN compared to Fox News is also worth noting as well. First, I will show you the several clips here from the CNN interview.
We do know that children can spread the virus. For example, there was a summer camp in Missouri which closed after 82 campers and staff tested positive. Texas says more than 1,300 children and employees in a child care facility tested positive. And here's what the CDC guidelines say. If children meet in groups, it can put everyone at risk. Children can pass this virus on to others who have an increased risk of severe illness from COVID-19. Why do you not have guidance on what a school should do just weeks before you want those schools to reopen? And what happens if it faces an outbreak?
You know, there's really good examples that have been utilized in the private sector and elsewhere, also with frontline workers and hospitals. And all of that data and all of that information and all of those examples can be referenced by school leaders.
But I'm not hearing a plan from the Department of Education. Do you have a plan for what students and what schools should do?
So schools should do what's right on the ground at that time for their students and for their situation. There is no one uniform approach that we can take or should take nationwide.
But can I just ask you,
because the needs of a school in the city of Detroit are very, in my home state, in the city of Detroit, would be very different than that of a school in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan.
And that's the point. That's completely understandable. But you are arguing over and over that they should handle this on a local level. But at the same time, as the Secretary of Education, you are trying to push them to do a one-size-fits-all approach, which is go back and reopen schools. You can't have it both ways.
I am urging all schools to open and to be providing their students a full-time education. We all acknowledge that that could and may well look different in a certain area that has a flare-up of the virus.
You are threatening to withhold federal education dollars from states that don't fully reopen schools this fall. To be clear, you don't have a lot of authority. About 90% of funding comes from the state and local level, but you do have control over some. Republican Senator Susan Collins said, quote, "I think we need more funding, not threats to withhold funding." How does it help to take any money away from school districts during a pandemic?
There's no desire to take money away. In fact, we want to see schools open and have been committed to ensuring the resources are there to do that. Remember, the CARES Act fund, over $13 billion has been distributed to the states, all of it in the states now. Only 2% of it has actually been spent yet or drawn down.
So no more threat
to do
withhold
just
funding?
The things that schools can be doing. The reality is we are committed to ensuring all students and all schools have the resources necessary for kids to be able to continue learning. And where schools don't follow through on that, you know, parents should have the opportunity and the option to find a school that is going to open and is going to serve their children.
Funding still alive or not? Yes or no?
We are committed to ensuring students are in school and learning, and parents need to have the flexibility and the resources.
All right. I'll have the Fox News clip coming up here in a minute, but the total lack of honesty. I mean, it's not surprising. Of course, none of this is surprising, but it is striking just how Betsy DeVos is trying to say, well, schools need to reopen. They need to reopen, but at the same time, they also, you know, some schools may want to take this their response a little differently depending on their situation. That's fine. But the actual message from the administration, from Betsy DeVos, as well as you're going to see in the Fox News clip where it's really clear, is that they're going to pull funding. They're going to pull funding if the school doesn't open. So they want schools to open, while at the same time they also want schools to take their own approach, while at the same time also saying that if you don't reopen, we're going to pull funding. So the obvious response here, or the obvious implication here, is that if you don't reopen, there's going to be consequences. Yet they're trying to hide their tracks by saying, well, every district's going to be different, so, it's total incompetence. Now, let me also, before I get to the Fox News clip, Ayanna Pressley here had a funny response, tweeting out, "You have no plan, Betsy DeVos. Teachers, kids, and parents are fearing for their lives. You point to a private sector that has put profits over people and claimed the lives of thousands of essential workers. I wouldn't trust you to care for a houseplant, let alone my child." And I think a lot of people can agree with that. Now, I'm going to get to a lot here, including, the breakdown of where the U.S. sits, and as well some information on research in terms of should schools reopen and is it safe for kids and that kind of thing. But first, quickly here, Betsy DeVos on Fox News, and notice how more open and honest she is with how she feels about this reopening.
Under what authority are you and the president going to unilaterally cut off funding, the funding that's been approved from Congress, and most of the money goes to disadvantaged students or students with disabilities? And secondly, isn't cutting off funding exactly the wrong answer? Don't you want to spend more money to make schools safer, whether it's with plastic shields or health checks, various other systems? Doesn't it make more sense to increase funding for schools where it's unsafe rather than cut off funding?
Look, American investment in education is a promise to students and their families. If schools aren't going to reopen and not fulfill that promise, they shouldn't get the funds. Then give it to the families to decide to go to a school that is going to meet that promise.
Well, you can't do that. I mean, I know you guys support vouchers, and I know you support vouchers, and that's a reasonable argument, but you can't do that unilaterally. You have to do that through Congress.
Well, we're looking at all the options because it's a promise to the American people, to students and their families, and we want to make sure that promise is followed through on.
Notice the difference here. Betsy DeVos is on Fox News, so she feels like she's in a safe space, so she's a little more honest about, yes, we want to pull funding, as opposed to in the interview with Dana Bash, she wouldn't answer the question. So here, I mean, you also see just the complete difference in tone. In this CNN interview, she talks about how, it's important that schools reopen, but at the same time, you have to worry about the schools that are, where it's not safe to reopen. Here, she's just straight up saying, no, if you don't reopen, we're pulling funding. Even though, as Chris Wallace here points out, there isn't really a way for them to do that without Congress. So it may just be an empty threat. I mean, it likely is an empty threat. But clearly here there is mixed messaging coming from the administration as a way to try and cover their tracks. Now, I want to go through some numbers here. So this is daily new confirmed COVID-19 cases per million people. Shown is the rolling 7-day average. I link to everything below the video under sources. I will link to this as well in the video under sources. You can also add countries, take away countries to get a good picture of how the U.S. compares. You see here the administration discussing reopening schools. Meanwhile, cases keep going up. And yes, this is per capita, so it's all relative. So U.S. cases spiking here. Meanwhile, I mean, even Sweden, that had an approach where they didn't really take the virus all that seriously either. Their numbers aren't all that good, but compared to the U.S., big difference. And then you look at Canada, Australia, Italy, South Korea, all down below after their initial spikes there at the beginning. So this is the worst. Like, think about when schools closed. Schools were closing around here, or not even like March, April, they were closed. And now they're discussing opening up schools when the U.S. cases are at their worst. Now, of course, it depends on the state. So this is overall. Florida right now is breaking records every single day with the amount of cases that they're seeing. So it depends state by state. New York is doing a little better now after having that initial spike. But going to what, Dana Bash was trying to say, yes, we understand it depends on the district, depends on the school. But if you're saying that you're going to pull funding if they don't reopen, then aren't you basically forcing these schools to reopen? Now, there are some places doing things a little differently here. Los Angeles and San Diego school districts will go online only in the fall. So this is another aspect of the reopening. The recommendation here is that if schools do reopen, they should have an online option, especially for whether it's parents or kids or teachers that are more susceptible or immunocompromised and are more likely to get the virus if they're in a situation like that. So regardless of where schools are opening, there should always be an online option for those people that are most at risk of getting the virus. But LA and San Diego school districts here going online only. They've already decided. And let me read a little research here. So this is from a CNN article. They compiled, I think, 3 different research papers here and the summaries. So in Germany, researchers found that children are just as infectious as adults and therefore cautioned against an unlimited reopening. A study from the Netherlands, however, concluded that children play a minor role in the spread of the virus. And in a recent study from China, scientists analyzed data from Wuhan and Shanghai to find that while children were roughly a third as likely to contract coronavirus in comparison to adults, going to school gave them 3 times as many chances to become infected, effectively making children just as much of a risk as much at risk as adults. Quote, while proactive school closures cannot interrupt transmission on their own, they can reduce peak incidence by 40 to 60% and delay the epidemic, the study found. The National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, part of the National Institutes of Health, launched its own study last month to get further clarification on whether children are less likely to catch coronavirus than adults, but the results will not be available until at least December. So gotta wait on that, and the discussion to reopen is happening right now. So it all depends on the approach, because everyone understands, especially I imagine if you have kids. I don't, so I'm not going to pretend to understand what it's like, but I can imagine, at least if you have your kids around all day and you have to work as well, or you have to go to work, or even working from home, it can be a problem. And when you're in a situation right now, as you are as Americans, where you don't have monthly income, you don't have the financial assistance from the government that other countries are offering their citizens, like a monthly universal basic income, or like in Canada, $2,000 a month. If you are impacted by the coronavirus, or if your children are impacted and you have to stay home and take care of them, you can get $2,000 a month. So Americans don't have that. So they're in a situation where they feel like they have to go back to work to be able to just live their life and pay the bills. So getting kids in school in that situation is important. But you also have to be able to weigh the risk, depending where you are. I mean, if you're in the middle of Florida right now, do you really want to go through with this? Considering that there have been cases, as Dana Bash pointed out in the beginning of that interview, where there has been super spreader events where a lot of kids have received the virus, or at least passed it on to adults, either people, adults that were taking care of those kids, or their parents. So just because you're in a situation where, yes, it is important to have kids in school, the psychological aspect of that as well, very important, it's always going to be a case-by-case basis. And regardless of how they open, how schools open, there has to be an online option for those parents that don't feel comfortable, or for those parents or kids that are immunocompromised, are most at risk. There has to be an online option for people. And it's clear that the Trump administration is just pushing to reopen and has no real guidelines for any of it.